Get out of my classroom, animal!
I'm registered for this class, Professor.
I don't care. I don't teach monkeys how to count.
Professor Gerald Whitmore threw a piece of chalk straight at Preston Cole's chest. It left a white mark over his heart. 30 students watched. Nobody said a word.
You want to prove you're not a waste of space? Solve this.
Whitmore scrawled a massive equation across the board.
Get it right, and I quit. Right here. Right now.
Preston stood up, wiped the chalk off his chest, picked up the broken piece from the floor.
Remember what you just said.
The class gasped. And what happened next turned that silence into the loudest chant that lecture hall had ever heard. Man, this story is wild. But to understand what just happened, we gotta go back to the beginning. Because nothing about this started the way you think it did. Let me take you back to where this started. Southside Chicago. A 2-bedroom apartment above a laundromat on Halsted Street. Preston Cole grew up with the sound of washing machines humming through the floor every night. His father was an electrician. His mother worked the night shift as a nurse at Stroger Hospital. They weren't poor, but they weren't comfortable either. Every dollar had a job before it hit the bank account. Preston found math the way some kids find trouble. By accident. He was 14, killing time at the public library because the apartment was too hot in July. He picked up a book on algebra, not because anyone told him to, because the cover had a pattern on it that didn't make sense to him. And Preston Cole could not leave a pattern unsolved. He finished that book in 2 weeks. Then the next one, then the next. By 16, he was reading papers online. Free ones, the kind buried in university archives that nobody downloads. By 18, he enrolled at a community college, not because he wasn't smart enough for a 4-year school, because no one told him he could apply. 2 years later, he transferred out with a 4.0 GPA, got into one of Chicago's top research universities, registered for Math 415, Advanced Abstract Algebra, the class he needed for his graduate school application. He walked into room 214 on the first day of fall semester, sat in the front row, opened his notebook. He was the only black student in the room. Now let me tell you about the man standing at the front of that room. Professor Gerald Whitmore had been teaching at that university for 24 years. He had tenure. He had 40 published papers. He had a corner office with his name on a brass plate. And he had a reputation that every student on campus knew about before they ever set foot in his class. Whitmore was a tyrant. Not the loud kind, the quiet kind, the kind who smiled while he buried you. His weapon wasn't yelling, it was grades. In Whitmore's class, grades were not earned, they were given. And they were given based on whatever Whitmore decided that morning. Same answer on 2 papers? One student gets a B+, another gets a D. No explanation, no appeal. You question him, you pay for it next time. Everyone knew, nobody talked. First week of class, a freshman named Danny Sullivan raised his hand, asked a question about notation. Simple question, honest question. Whitmore stared at him for 5 seconds, then said, loud enough for every seat to hear, "If you have to ask that, you shouldn't be in college." Danny Sullivan never raised his hand again. Not once. For the rest of the semester, he sat in the back corner with his head down. A student who came in curious left that room, afraid to speak. Then there was Tyler Henderson, senior. Needed this class to graduate. Tyler did everything right. Showed up early, turned in every assignment, studied on weekends. He submitted a problem set that was correct. Every step. Every answer. But the format wasn't exactly what Whitmore wanted. Tyler got a D. He went to Whitmore's office, politely asked to review the grade. Whitmore leaned back in his chair and said, "Question my grading again, and I'll make sure you repeat this course." Tyler never said another word about it. That was the world of room 214, a classroom where the professor held every student's future in his hands and squeezed whenever he felt like it. But with Preston, it was different. With Preston, it was personal. Whitmore never called on him when his hand was up. Ever. He'd look right past Preston, like the seat was empty. But the moment Preston put his hand down, that's when Whitmore pounced. He'd fire a question at Preston without warning. When Preston answered correctly, and he always answered correctly, Whitmore would say nothing, just move on. No acknowledgement, no nod, nothing. But when Preston hesitated, when he paused for even 2 seconds to think, Whitmore would tilt his head and say, "This is what happens when standards are lowered for the sake of diversity." He said it like he was commenting on the weather. Casual, matter of fact, and every single student heard it. And every single student looked away. Preston never reacted. He'd close his notebook, sit back, and stare straight ahead until the next question came. But one afternoon, sitting in the back of the library, he pulled out a research paper and started reading. Not for class, not for homework. Something else entirely. He bookmarked a page, wrote a note in the margin, and if anyone had looked over his shoulder, they would have seen the name on that paper, Gerald Whitmore. 5 weeks in. That's how long Preston lasted before everything changed. It was a Tuesday, overcast, the kind of Chicago morning where the sky looks like concrete. Preston walked into room 214 at 8:55. Same seat, front row, notebook open, pen ready. Whitmore was already at the board. He was writing a proof, something about symmetric groups and permutation structures. Group theory. The kind of math that separates students who memorize from students who understand. Whitmore wrote fast, chalk tapping the board like a heartbeat. He filled the left side, moved to the center, kept going. When he finished, he stepped back and admired his own work the way a painter admires a portrait. "This mapping," he said, tapping line 3, "preserves the group operation across all subgroup structures." He turned to the class, scanned the room. 30 faces staring back. His eyes passed over Preston's raised hand like it wasn't there. "Can anyone explain why?" Silence. Then Whitmore smiled. That smile, the one that meant someone was about to have a bad morning. "Mr. Cole." Preston's hand was already down. He'd given up raising it weeks ago. "Since you insist on sitting in the front row of my class, surely you have something useful to contribute." Whitmore crossed his arms. "Or is community college algebra the ceiling for you?" A few students shifted in their seats. Danny Sullivan stared at his desk. Tyler Henderson gripped his pen. Preston stood up. "The mapping you described preserves the operation when the subgroup is abelian. But for non-abelian cases, the structure doesn't, I didn't ask for a lecture." Whitmore's voice cut like glass. "Sit down. Clearly, transfer students need to learn when to stop talking." Preston didn't sit down. And that was the moment room 214 changed. "Professor." Preston's voice was steady, quiet, but every syllable carried. "I wasn't finished. And there's something wrong with your proof on the board." The room stopped breathing. In 24 years, no student had ever said those words to Gerald Whitmore. Not in a lecture, not in office hours, not in an email. No one had ever stood in front of that man in his own classroom and told him he was wrong. Whitmore's face went red. He took a step toward Preston, then another, close enough that Preston could smell the coffee on his breath. "Excuse me? You're telling me, that there's an error?" "Yes, sir." Preston pointed at the board. "Line 3. The mapping doesn't hold for non-abelian subgroups. There's a specific counterexample." Whitmore stared at him. Then he grabbed a piece of chalk from the ledge and threw it at Preston's chest. Hard. It bounced off and left a white streak right over his heart. Nobody moved. Whitmore turned to the board. He wrote a new equation. Bigger. Longer. The kind of problem that graduate students struggled with. The kind that didn't show up in any undergraduate textbook. He turned back around. "You think you're smarter than me? You think you're smarter than everyone in this room?" His voice filled every corner of room 214. Fine. Solve this. Get it right, and I quit. Right here, right now, in front of everyone. 30 witnesses. A public dare. Words that couldn't be taken back. Preston looked down at the chalk on the floor, the same piece that had just hit his chest. He bent down and picked it up. Remember what you just said. He walked to the board, and as he did, he noticed something. The equation Whitmore had just written, the structure of it, the way the variables were arranged, the specific assumption buried in the third line. He'd seen it before. Not in a textbook, not in a lecture, in a research paper, published 12 years ago, written by Gerald Whitmore. Preston didn't say a word about it. Not yet. He just smiled. Barely. Just enough that no one noticed. Behind him, Olivia Turner slipped her phone out of her pocket. Not to record. She opened her messages and typed 3 words to a number she'd saved 2 days ago. The number for the dean's office. It's happening again. The room held its breath. Preston stood at the board with that broken piece of chalk in his hand. Whitmore stood 3 feet behind him, arms crossed, smiling. 30 students sat frozen in their seats like witnesses at a trial. Preston didn't start writing. Not right away. He read the equation, every line, every symbol. His eyes moved left to right, then back again. 10 seconds passed. 15. Whitmore shifted his weight. Any day now, Mr. Cole. Or do you need me to explain what the symbols mean first? Preston didn't turn around. He just lifted the chalk and started writing. But he didn't write what anyone expected. Instead of solving the equation the standard way, the way it was taught in every textbook, the way Whitmore had drilled into his students for 24 years, Preston did something different. He translated the entire problem into a matrix representation, a completely different framework. Like someone solving a maze by flying over it instead of walking through it. The chalk moved fast. No hesitation, no erasing. Line after line appeared on the board like they'd been there all along, just waiting for someone to uncover them. Whitmore's smile faded, just slightly. This wasn't what he expected. This wasn't the approach he prepared for. A student in the second row leaned forward, then another. Olivia Turner tilted her head, following the logic on the board, the way you follow a song you almost recognize. Preston filled the right side of the board. Then he stopped. He drew a horizontal line underneath his work, and below it he wrote a single sentence. This problem contains an implicit assumption about commutativity. Without stating it, the solution branches into 2 cases. He turned around and looked at Whitmore. Professor, your equation assumes that the operation is commutative at step 3. But you haven't proven that. For this specific algebraic structure, commutativity doesn't hold in every case. Whitmore didn't respond. That means there are 2 valid paths, not 1. Preston turned back to the board. He split the remaining space into 2 columns. Left column, he wrote Case 1 at the top. Right column, Case 2. Then he solved both. Case 1 produced the answer Whitmore expected. The textbook answer, the correct answer. Preston wrote it clean and circled it. Case 2 produced something completely different. A second, valid solution that existed because the assumption Whitmore took for granted was exactly that, an assumption, not a fact. Preston circled that answer too. 2 answers, both correct, both proven. Because the foundation of the original equation had a crack that nobody in 24 years had bothered to look for. Then Preston did something that made the room go cold. He walked back to Whitmore's original equation, the one still written on the left side of the board from the beginning of class. He drew a circle around line 3. And next to it, in small, precise letters, he wrote, "Assumes abelian structure without proof." He set the chalk on the ledge. Not dropped. Set. Gently. Then he turned around. Both solutions are valid, Professor. Your equation has a gap. He paused. And I solved it anyway. 5 seconds of silence. The kind of silence that has weight. The kind you can feel pressing against your chest. Olivia Turner covered her mouth with her hand. Her eyes were wide. Not shock. Recognition. She'd looked at that proof for a week and never seen what Preston just exposed in 10 minutes. Danny Sullivan sat up straight for the first time all semester. His shoulders lifted. His eyes were locked on the board like he was seeing sunlight after months in a basement. Tyler Henderson looked at the board, looked at Whitmore, looked back at the board. His lips moved quietly, checking the math. Then he nodded, slow, certain. 2 students in the middle row whispered to each other. One of them said, just barely loud enough to hear, "Oh my God." And Whitmore stood perfectly still. 3 seconds. The longest silence anyone in that room had ever witnessed from him. His jaw tightened. His eyes moved across the board. Preston's work, then his own equation, then back again. Then he straightened his tie. Creative. His voice was flat, controlled, but something underneath it had cracked. But creative shortcuts don't replace rigor. Sit down, Mr. Cole. That was it. No acknowledgement. No correction. No admission that Preston was right. Just a wave of the hand and 2 words that had ended every conversation Whitmore didn't want to have for 24 years. Sit down. Preston walked back to his seat. His face showed nothing. No triumph, no frustration. Just the steady expression of a man who already knew how this would go. As he passed Olivia's desk, she looked up at him. It was the first time all semester that anyone in that class had looked at Preston with something other than pity or avoidance. It was respect. Preston sat down, opened his notebook, wrote something in the margin, same page as before, same paper he'd been reading in the library. More notes, more connections. He didn't look up for the rest of class. Up at the front, Whitmore moved on to the next topic. His voice was the same. His posture was the same. His authority filled the room the same way it always had. But his hand trembled when he picked up the chalk. Just slightly. Just once. And from the 3rd row, Olivia Turner noticed. She didn't say anything. Not yet. But she took out her phone under the desk and saved a photo of the board before Whitmore could erase it. Because something told her this wasn't over. Not even close. Instead of admitting what happened, Whitmore declared war. The next class, he walked into room 214 like nothing had changed. Same tie, same posture, same chalk in hand. He didn't mention Preston's proof, didn't mention the 2 solutions, didn't mention the gap in line 3. He just started teaching. But everything was different, and everyone felt it. The first sign came when Whitmore handed back the weekly problem set. Preston opened his paper. Red ink at the top. D+. Below the grade, 1 line of feedback. Methodology not consistent with course standards. Preston read it twice, then a 3rd time. He flipped through the pages. Every step was correct. Every answer was right. He'd checked the work 3 times before submitting. There was nothing wrong with the methodology, nothing wrong with the math. The only thing wrong was the name at the top of the page. Olivia sat 1 seat over from a student named Adam Wells. She glanced at his paper. B+. She looked closer. His approach was nearly identical to Preston's. Same structure, same logic, same answers. 2 letter grades apart. She leaned toward Preston after class. "This isn't grading," she whispered. "This is punishment." Preston folded the paper in half, slipped it into his bag. "I know." He didn't file a complaint, didn't argue, didn't go to Whitmore's office. He just showed up to the next class. Same seat, front row, notebook open. And Whitmore made him pay for it. Every single class became a trial. Whitmore called on Preston at least 3 times per session, not with normal questions, with questions designed to break him. Topics that hadn't been covered yet, theorems from chapters they wouldn't reach for weeks, material so obscure it barely appeared in the textbook's appendix. When Preston answered correctly, and he almost always answered correctly, Whitmore said nothing, moved on. No nod, no acknowledgement, like the answer had come from an empty chair. But when Preston paused, when he took even 2 seconds to collect his thoughts before speaking, Whitmore would tilt his head and say something like, "Perhaps this program isn't the right fit for everyone." Or, "Some students are simply promoted beyond their abilities." Or, and this one he saved for a Tuesday when the room was especially quiet, "Affirmative action can get you through the door. It can't get you through the exam." He said it looking directly at Preston, then moved on like he'd announced the weather. And it wasn't just Preston anymore. Whitmore's anger spilled over onto the entire class, like a fire that started in one corner and spread to every wall. Danny Sullivan got called to the board the following week. He was shaking before he even picked up the chalk. He wrote the first step of a proof. Got it wrong. Whitmore didn't wait. "Get out! Come back when you can do basic arithmetic." Danny stood there for a moment, chalk still in his hand. Then he put it down, packed his bag, and walked out of room 214 without looking at anyone. Nobody stopped him. Nobody said a word. Tyler Henderson submitted his next assignment. Clean work, correct answers, clear handwriting. Whitmore handed it back with one word across the top. Unreadable. Tyler stared at his paper. The handwriting was perfectly legible, every line neat, every number clear. He looked up at Whitmore. Whitmore was already teaching, already past it, already done. Tyler put the paper in his bag and didn't speak for the rest of the week. That was room 214 now. A place where asking a question could end your semester. Where correct answers got D's. Where the professor punished the whole class because one student had the nerve to be right. And still, nobody said anything. Because Whitmore held their grades, and grades held their futures. And everyone in that room had something to lose. Everyone, except one person who had already lost everything Whitmore could take. 3 nights after Danny got kicked out of class, Olivia sent a message. Not to Preston, to the Dean of Mathematics. Anonymous. She described what she'd seen, the grading, the insults, the chalk, all of it. 2 days later, she got a response. Short, professional. "Thank you for your concern. Anonymous reports are noted, but formal action requires direct, verifiable evidence. We encourage you to follow up through official channels." Olivia stared at the screen. Direct, verifiable evidence. That meant someone with authority had to see it happen. In person. With their own eyes. She almost closed the email. Almost gave up. Then she typed one more message. Not to the dean's office this time. To Preston. They need proof. In person. Someone has to be there to see it. Preston read it at 11:15 that night. Sitting in the library. The same table he always used. The one near the window with a streetlight made it bright enough to read without the overhead lamp. He set his phone down and picked up the paper he'd been reading all week. Gerald Whitmore's paper. Published 12 years ago. Journal of Algebraic Structures, Volume 31, pages 114 to 132. He read Theorem 4 again, slowly, line by line. And this time, he didn't just see the gap. He saw everything. The equation Whitmore had thrown at him in class, the unsolvable challenge, was a modified version of Theorem 4 from this paper. Same structure, same variables, same assumption buried in the third step. But it went deeper than that. Preston pulled up the midterm review outline Whitmore had distributed the week before. 3 of the 5 major topics were built on frameworks from this same paper. The same flawed paper. The same unverified assumption. Whitmore hadn't just made one mistake on one board. He had built an entire semester on research that had a crack in its foundation. And he didn't know it. Preston closed the paper, put it in his bag, zipped it shut. Tomorrow was the last review session before midterms. 30 students, one classroom, one professor who had never been wrong, and one piece of chalk. Man, are you serious right now? This kid taught himself math from library books, and he's catching mistakes in a professor's published research, and still getting treated like he's nothing. Put yourself in that seat. 30 people watching, nobody saying a word. How long would you last? Every class after that felt like walking into a courtroom where the judge had already decided you were guilty. Preston kept showing up. Same seat, same notebook, same silence. But behind that silence, something was building. Not just in him, in the whole room. 4 classes before midterms. 4 chances for everything to break. The first one started with a trap. Whitmore wrote a proof on the board. Long. Dense. Then he turned around and crossed his arms. I want every student in this room to examine this proof. Find the error, if there is one. He paused. Let the silence do its work. You have 5 minutes. 30 heads went down. Notebooks opened. Pens scratched paper. 5 minutes passed. Nobody spoke. Whitmore smiled. That smile. See? Sometimes the work speaks for itself. When a proof is built correctly, there's nothing to... Line 6. Every head turned. Preston hadn't raised his hand. Hadn't stood up. Just spoke from his seat. Calm. Flat. Like he was reading a grocery list. The induction step skips a case. When n equals 1, the base case holds. But the transition from n to n plus 1 assumes a property that only works for n greater than 2. The case where n equals 2 is missing. Silence. Whitmore turned to the board. His eyes moved to line 6. He stared at it. 3 seconds. 5 seconds. The proof had an error, right where Preston said it would be. Whitmore picked up the eraser, wiped line 6 clean, rewrote it, didn't look at Preston. A lucky guess. That's all he said. Then he moved on. But it wasn't a lucky guess, and every student in that room knew it. That was the 3rd time Preston had found an error that nobody else could see. 3rd time in a row. 3 for 3. And Whitmore still couldn't say his name without making it sound like an insult. The second class was the one that nearly broke Preston. Whitmore handed back the midterm review assignment. Preston opened his. Red ink across the top. F. 1 letter. No explanation. Just a note in the margin. Does not meet minimum standards of academic rigor. Preston stared at it. He had checked this assignment 3 times before submitting. Triple-checked every proof. Verified every step. He could defend every line on that paper in front of any mathematician in the country. Olivia looked over. She'd seen enough of Preston's work by now to know what an A looked like coming from his hand. Preston, she kept her voice low, I wrote a worse paper than that and got a B. Preston folded the paper. Once, twice, slid it into his bag. He's not grading my math. Preston's voice was quiet. Tired, not angry, just drained. He's grading my skin. He said it like a fact, because by now, that's what it was. The 3rd class was the one where everything started to shift. Whitmore called Danny Sullivan to the board. Danny, who hadn't spoken in class since getting kicked out 3 weeks earlier. Danny, whose hands started shaking the moment Whitmore said his name. He walked to the board like a man walking to the edge of a cliff. Picked up the chalk, started writing. His first step was wrong. Not completely wrong. He'd just switched 2 operations. An easy fix, a 1-second correction. But Whitmore didn't give him that second. This is embarrassing. Can anyone in this room? Preston stood up. He didn't ask permission, didn't raise his hand, just got out of his seat and walked to the board. Stood next to Danny. Close enough that Danny could hear him, but Whitmore couldn't. You started right. Just switch step 2 and 3. Danny looked at him, blinked, then looked at the board. His hand moved. He erased the 2 lines, rewrote them. Correct. The answer was right. Whitmore's jaw tightened. I didn't ask for a tutor. Sit down, both of you. They walked back to their seats. But as Preston passed Tyler Henderson's desk, Tyler gave him a small nod. Quick, almost invisible, but deliberate. Danny slid into his seat in the back corner. As Preston passed, Danny whispered one word. Thanks. First word Danny had said in class in 3 weeks. And from one row behind, Olivia watched all of it. She watched Tyler nod. She watched Danny whisper. She watched 30 students who had been silent for weeks begin to look at Preston not as a target, but as something else. Someone worth following. The 4th class was the one that almost ended it. Whitmore announced that midterms would count for 40% of the final grade. His exam, his questions, his grading. No appeals, no second chances. Then he looked at Preston, directly, without pretending otherwise. I suggest everyone studies properly this time. Some of you clearly can't rely on talent you don't have. That night, Preston sat on the concrete steps outside his dorm building, elbows on knees, head down. The kind of posture that says everything words can't. Olivia walked by, stopped, sat down next to him, didn't say anything for a full minute. He's going to fail you no matter what you write, she said. I know. So why do you keep showing up? Preston didn't answer right away. He looked out at the parking lot. A streetlight buzzed above them. Because he doesn't get to decide what I'm worth. Olivia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I filed a complaint 2 weeks ago, anonymous. Preston looked at her. Someone from the dean's office wrote back. They said anonymous isn't enough. They need direct evidence, in person. Someone with authority has to see it happen. She let that sit. Tomorrow is the last review session before midterms. If it's going to happen again, and we both know it will, tomorrow is the day. Preston nodded. Slow. That night, he called his mother. Mom, I don't know if I can keep doing this. Her voice came through tired but warm. The voice of a woman who'd worked 12-hour shifts for 20 years and never once called in sick. Baby, are you eating? Preston laughed, just barely. Yeah, Mom. Silence. The kind that sits between people who love each other and don't need to fill every second with sound. They don't think I belong here. His mother's response came without hesitation, without doubt. Since when do you need anyone's permission to be who you are? Preston didn't answer, but the next morning he got up early, went to the library, opened his bag, pulled out Gerald Whitmore's paper, Journal of Algebraic Structures, Volume 31, Theorem 4. He read it one more time, cover to cover, made his final notes, highlighted the exact line, wrote down the journal name, the year, and the page number in blue ink on a separate piece of paper. Then he folded it, put it in his front pocket, and walked to room 214. The night before the last review session, Preston sat alone in the library until midnight. He wasn't studying for midterms. He was staring at a research paper he'd already read 11 times. Gerald Whitmore, Journal of Algebraic Structures, Volume 31, published 12 years ago, cited over 30 times by other researchers around the world. Theorem 4, page 12. Preston had found the gap weeks ago. The unverified assumption about commutativity. The same gap he'd called out on the board. But tonight, he saw something bigger. Something that changed everything. He pulled up the midterm review outline Whitmore had handed out last week. 5 topics, 5 major sections the exam would cover. Preston laid the outline next to the paper, side by side. Topic 1. built on a framework from Section 3 of Whitmore's paper. Topic 3. A direct application of Theorem 4. Topic 5. An extension of the same flawed assumption. 3 out of 5. Preston leaned back in his chair, stared at the ceiling. This wasn't about one equation on one board. Whitmore had built half the semester on his own published research, and that research had a crack running through it that nobody, not the journal reviewers, not the 30-plus researchers who cited it, not Whitmore himself, had ever caught. Which meant half the midterm was built on a broken foundation. Preston had two choices. He could stay quiet, solve the midterm the standard way, use the flawed assumption like everyone else, get the correct answers, pass the class, move on. Or he could tell the truth. Not privately, not in an email, not in office hours, in front of 30 students, in front of a man who had spent 24 years never being wrong. He could expose the flaw, publicly, and bring the whole thing down. One option was safe. The other was a bomb. His phone buzzed. 11 p.m. A text from Olivia. Heard something from the dean's office. Someone from administration will be near our classroom tomorrow. Don't know who. Preston read it twice. Tomorrow. 30 students. The last review session. Whitmore at the board. And somewhere nearby, someone with the authority to do what anonymous complaints couldn't. He looked at the paper, looked at his phone, looked at the folded piece of paper in his bag with the journal name, the year, and the page number written in blue ink. He zipped his bag shut. Tomorrow. This is where it all comes down to. Preston walked into room 214 at 8:50, bag heavier than usual. The paper was inside. The room was full. Danny in the back corner, Tyler in row 3, Olivia next to Preston. She nodded once. Outside, in the hallway, Dean Eleanor Brooks stood next to the small window on the classroom door, folder in hand. She could see the board. She could see everything. Nobody inside knew she was there. Whitmore started at 9. He wrote a long proof across the board. When he finished, he tapped the board twice. This is the final review before midterms. This is what separates real mathematicians from pretenders. His eyes found Preston. Mr. Cole, no brave words today? Or did you finally realize you're out of your depth? Preston stood up, walked to the board, started writing. But he didn't follow the standard approach. He went the direction that led straight to the flaw in Whitmore's paper. 4 lines in. Whitmore saw it. Stop! You're deviating from the structured proof. Preston kept writing. I'm not deviating. I'm correct. Whitmore stepped forward and snatched the chalk out of Preston's hand. Not gently. The way you take a toy from a child. I said stop. Sit down. Now. Then Whitmore turned to the class. Let me be very clear. This student, this transfer student, has been disrupting my class all semester. He got into this university through a quota. Not merit, not talent, a quota. 30 people heard every word. He cannot follow instructions. He cannot respect authority. And he certainly cannot do mathematics at this level. Danny stared at his desk so hard his eyes watered. Tyler gripped his chair. Olivia's eyes turned red. Nobody spoke. 24 years of silence held that room like a cage. Preston stood at the board, hands empty, chalk taken, voice taken. He looked down at his shirt. The white streak from the first day was still there. He'd never washed it out. He could walk back to his seat, sit down, accept it. Nobody would blame him. That's how it always worked in room 214. His hands dropped, his shoulders fell. For the first time all semester, Preston Cole looked ready to give up. Then he heard it. A scrape of something sliding across wood. Danny Sullivan, the kid who hadn't spoken in weeks, who got kicked out for asking a question, pushed a piece of chalk across his desk toward the aisle. He didn't say a word, just pushed the chalk. Tyler Henderson stood up, walked to the supply box at the front table, took out a piece of chalk, set it on the desk closest to Preston. Then Olivia stood up. She bent down and picked up something from the floor near her seat A small piece of chalk. Broken. The same piece Whitmore had thrown at Preston's chest weeks ago. It had rolled under her desk that day. She'd never thrown it away. She walked to Preston, took his hand, placed the chalk in his palm, closed his fingers around it. 3 pieces of chalk. From 3 students who had spent an entire semester too afraid to breathe. Preston looked at Danny. Danny's head was down, but his hand was shaking, not from fear this time. Preston looked at Tyler. 1 nod. Certain. Preston looked at Olivia, eyes red but steady. Finish it, she said. He tightened his grip on the chalk, the one that had hit his chest, the one that left a mark over his heart, and turned back to the board. Preston turned back to the board, and this time, nobody was going to stop him. Whitmore stepped forward. I said, sit! No. 1 word. But it hit the room like a thunderclap. Preston didn't raise his voice, didn't turn around. He just said it and started writing. Whitmore opened his mouth, closed it. That no wasn't angry. It wasn't defiant. It was final. Preston drew a vertical line down the center of the board. Left side, standard approach. Right side, corrected approach. Then he filled both columns. Side by side, line by line. The chalk moved fast, steady, no hesitation, no erasing. The only sound in room 214 was chalk on slate. Both columns grew, identical for the first 3 steps. Then they split. Preston stopped at line 4 on the left column, drew a circle around it. Here, he tapped the circle. This is where it breaks. He faced the room. The standard approach assumes the operation is commutative at this step. Every textbook makes this assumption. Every student in this room has been taught to make it. He pointed to the right column. But for this structure, commutativity hasn't been proven. It's been assumed. And assumptions aren't math. Below both columns, he wrote a counterexample. 3 lines. Simple, specific. Plug this in. Check it yourself. The property doesn't hold. Olivia checked. Nodded. Tyler checked. Nodded. The whisper spread row by row like a wave. Then Preston reached into his bag, pulled out a stack of papers, stapled, highlighted, dog-eared at page 12. He held it up. This assumption doesn't come from the textbook. He read the title aloud, the journal name, the year, the author. Gerald Whitmore, Journal of Algebraic Structures, Volume 31, published 12 years ago. The room went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights buzzing. Theorem 4, page 12. This assumption appears in your published research, Professor. It has been cited over 30 times, and it is incomplete. Whitmore's face drained white. You didn't just make an error on 1 problem. You built half this course on a foundation with a crack in it. Preston turned back to the right column, completed the final 4 lines, the corrected proof. Every step clean, every transition justified, the kind of solution that doesn't just solve a problem, it makes the problem look simple. He set the chalk down on the ledge, gently. That small click was the loudest sound in the room. He turned, faced Whitmore, 30 students between them. Your equation, your error, your words, solve this, and I quit. Pause. I solved it. 5 seconds of silence that felt like 5 minutes. Whitmore stood in the middle of room 214, mouth open, then closed, eyes moving from left column to right column to the paper on the desk. He had nothing. Because math doesn't care about tenure. Math doesn't care about 24 years. Math is either right or it's wrong. Olivia stood up first. He's right. I checked it. The counterexample holds. Tyler stood next. I checked it too. Then row 4. Then row 2. Then 3 more in the back. Danny Sullivan rose from his corner seat. Slowly. He didn't say a word, just stood, hands at his sides. Someone in the middle said it first. You said you'd quit. Then someone else. Quit. Olivia. Quit. Tyler. Quit. Danny opened his mouth, first word in over a month. quit. One by one, then together, 30 voices that had been locked in silence all semester. Quit, 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 quit. The sound filled room 214, bounced off the walls, spilled into the hallway, where Dean Eleanor Brooks had been standing for 15 minutes. She opened the door. The chanting stopped. Brooks walked straight to the board, read both columns, picked up the paper, read Theorem 4. 10 seconds. Mr. Cole's proof is correct. The assumption in the referenced paper is incomplete. She turned to Whitmore. Professor Whitmore, my office, after class. Whitmore stood there. 30 students on their feet, a dean at the door, a proof on the board that couldn't be erased. And for the first time in 24 years, Gerald Whitmore had no answer. What happened after that class was something nobody expected, least of all Whitmore. Dean Brooks walked him out of room 214 that morning. 30 students stood and watched until the door closed behind them. Nobody sat down for a long time. By the end of that week, the dominoes started falling. Brooks launched a formal investigation, not just into what happened in the classroom, into everything. 3 years of grading records, every assignment, every exam, every score Gerald Whitmore had ever entered into the system. The pattern was obvious once someone finally looked. Minority students in Whitmore's classes received consistently lower grades than their peers for work of equal or superior quality. Not by a little, by full letter grades, semester after semester, year after year. It wasn't a bad day. It wasn't a tough grader. It was a system, and it had been running for years under a name no one dared to question. The paper was next. The university contacted the Journal of Algebraic Structures. Whitmore was required to submit a formal erratum, a published correction acknowledging the flaw in Theorem 4. 12 years, 30-plus citations. Every study that relied on that assumption would need to be reviewed. His name would be on the correction, permanently, for every researcher in the world to see. Then came the part no one saw coming. Tyler Henderson wrote an email to Dean Brooks that Friday afternoon. He didn't write it for himself. If Preston Cole's grades were manipulated, please check mine too. And Danny Sullivan's, and every other student who sat in that room and stayed quiet because they were afraid. Brooks checked. 11 students in that semester alone had grades that didn't match the quality of their work. 11. All corrected within 2 weeks. Preston's F became an A. His D+ became an A-. Every score Whitmore had used as a weapon was taken apart and rebuilt on actual merit. Whitmore wasn't fired. Tenure made that complicated. But he was suspended from teaching, removed from every academic committee, and barred from advising students. His corner office stayed. His brass nameplate stayed. But room 214 got a new professor the following Monday. 24 years of reputation. Gone in 15 minutes. Preston got the email about his grade correction on a Tuesday evening. Sitting in the library, same table, same window, same streetlight. He opened it, read it again. Then he closed his laptop, leaned back, and just breathed. No celebration, no fist pump, no phone call. Just a long, slow exhale from a man who had been holding his breath for an entire semester. 1 week later, hallway outside room 214. Preston was walking to his next class when he saw Whitmore coming from the opposite direction. Same suit, same tie. But something was different. The posture, the shoulders, lower, like a man carrying something invisible and heavy. They stopped 3 feet apart. Whitmore didn't look at Preston right away. He looked at the floor, then the wall, then, finally, at the man standing in front of him. The student's proof is valid. His voice was quiet, stripped of everything it used to carry. Your approach to the factorization problem was unconventional, but correct. No apology, no warmth, no handshake. 24 years of authority compressed into 12 words that cost him more than any paper he'd ever published. Preston nodded. Thank you, Professor. That was it. No victory speech, no lecture about justice, just 2 words and a nod from a man who didn't need Gerald Whitmore to tell him what he already knew. Preston walked away. Whitmore stood in that hallway alone. 2 weeks later, Preston opened an envelope at his kitchen table. Acceptance letter. Graduate program in mathematics. An Ivy League university. Full scholarship. The recommendation letter attached was signed by Dean Eleanor Brooks. He met with her one last time before the semester ended. Her office was warm, books everywhere. A framed photo on the wall, a young black woman in a graduation gown from the 1980s. Brooks, 30 years ago. I'm not going to give you a speech, she said. You've heard enough speeches. Preston smiled, but I will tell you this. 30 years ago, I stood exactly where you stood. Different room, different professor, same silence. Nobody handed me a thing. She leaned forward. Go make them uncomfortable. Preston laughed. First real laugh in months. The next day, Olivia found him in the cafeteria. Danny and Tyler were with her. Danny was talking. Full sentences. Eye contact. Something had come back to life in that kid since the day he pushed a piece of chalk across his desk. You know what you did, right? Danny said. Preston shook his head. I just solved a math problem. Nah, Danny smiled. You made it okay to stand up. Tyler nodded. Olivia didn't say anything. She just sat down across from Preston and opened her notebook. Back to studying. Back to normal. But a different kind of normal. The kind where people aren't afraid anymore. That night, Preston called his mother. Mom, I got in. Silence on the other end. 1 second. 2. Then a sound. Small. Broken. The sound of a woman crying who promised herself she wouldn't. I never doubted you, baby. Not once. Preston closed his eyes. Let the words sit. Let them fill every empty space that this semester had carved into him. I know, Mom. I know. The last day of the semester, Preston walked past room 214 one more time. The door was open. The room was empty. New chalk in the supply box. Clean board. But if you looked close, really close, you could still see faint marks on the left side of the board. Ghost lines. The shadow of 2 columns that changed everything. Preston stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he reached into his pocket, pulled out a small piece of chalk. Broken. The one Olivia had placed in his hand that day. He set it on the ledge, right in the center of the board, and walked away. Bro, a piece of chalk thrown at your chest? And you use that same chalk to end a man's whole career? Imagine that was you standing at that board. What would you do? Drop it in the comments. Like this if it hit you. Share it. Subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.